My son abandoned me in a cheap motel on the outskirts. I was hungry, thirsty, and had no identification. I helped a crying girl in the parking lot. Then she pressed a set of glittering keys into my hand and whispered, "Keep them. The house is yours now." Why would a stranger give me her entire estate? "If you open that gate, you can't go back," she warned. I turned the key. The gate opened, and the secrets began to fall. My name is Evelyn Hart. I am 63 years old, a widow from the quiet, predictable town of Maple Bend, Ohio. My skin is fair, which means it shows the sun and the worry. And for most of my life, the worry has come from one place. I spent everything I had, every hour, raising my only son, Thomas. He called this trip a reconciliation, a few days away in Ridgeway Springs, just the two of us. But when I got to the car, his partner, Sloane Pierce, was in the passenger seat, tapping at her phone. She smiled, all teeth and polite angles, but her eyes were as cold as polished stone. We ended up at the Juniper Motel. The sign outside had a flickering N, making it the Juper. Thomas insisted on handling the check-in. That night, in the room that smelled of stale smoke and bleach. He asked for my phone. "Just need to confirm the tickets for tomorrow." "Mom?" he said, his voice smooth. He walked outside to get a better signal. He came back in. But the phone didn't. Later, when I was getting ready for bed, I couldn't find my wallet, my driver's license, my bank card. The $20-odd in cash I kept all gone. It must have fallen out in the car. "Mum," Thomas said, not looking up from his own screen. "We'll find it in the morning." Sloane was already asleep, or pretending to be. I didn't sleep. In the morning, Thomas and Sloane were gone. A dent in the pillow next to mine was the only sign they'd ever been there. I went to the front desk, the thin carpet cold under my socks. The receptionist, a young man with tired eyes, didn't make eye contact. "Ma'am, the room was only paid through 11 a.m., he said flatly. "Your son checked out around 5. At 11 a.m. exactly. A security guard gently but firmly escorted me out of the lobby. He wasn't unkind, but he was immovable. "Policy," he murmured. I was pushed out onto the concrete curb of a service road I didn't recognize. I had nothing but the clothes I was wearing, my empty canvas travel bag, and an old grey cardigan. The high, thin clouds did nothing to block the sun, and the heat was already building. First came the thirst, a dry, scratching feeling in my throat. Then the hunger, a hollow ache in my stomach. But beneath both was a cold, pure humiliation. It was so profound it burned away the shock, and in its place, something else flickered to life, a silent, patient anger I had spent decades swallowing. This was the modern world. People rushed past in their cars, eyes glued forward, avoiding the sight of a woman on the curb. I tried talking to a police officer who was fueling his cruiser at the gas station across the street. He listened for a moment, sighed, and suggested I contact my consulate, as if Maple Bend were in another country. He drove away. The sun began to dip, painting the smoggy sky in shades of dirty orange. I sat on the curb, the concrete still warm, and watched the parking lot empty out. The only sound was the rhythmic, rattling hum of the motel's massive air conditioning unit. It sounded like a clock, ticking down the last minutes of the life I knew. That's when I saw her. A young woman, maybe in her late 20s, stood beside a sleek silver sedan. She was wearing a simple, expensive-looking blue dress. Her body was racked with sobs, deep tearing sounds. On the pavement at her feet lay a shattered smartphone. In one hand, she clutched a thick manila envelope. In the other, a large, glittering set of keys. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen, and saw me watching. She didn't look scared, just desperate. She took a shaky step toward me, wiping her face. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Can you help me? I need directions." She held out a slip of paper, and then she truly looked at me, her gaze locking onto my tired, worn face. Her sobbing stopped, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of breath, as if she hadn't just found a random old woman, but the exact person she had been waiting for. The young woman, who I would soon know as Lena Vale, held out the crumpled slip of paper. The handwriting was sharp, precise, written in a thick black pen. It read, "Renfield Estate, South Gate." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping so low I could barely hear it above the highway hum. "The people inside," she said, her eyes wide with a specific, manicured terror. "They aren't safe." I looked from her expensive dress back to the flickering Jupa sign, then to my own empty canvas bag on the curb. I was 63 years old, penniless, betrayed, and invisible. My son had left me to vanish. What good was my conscience now? But then again, what else did I have left? A fragmented image flashed in my mind, a green and white road sign I had seen from Thomas's car window, just before the sudden turn-off for the motel. Renfield. I had noticed it only because the name sounded old-fashioned, out of place among the fast food joints and budget lodgings. "I think I know the way," I said. My voice was hoarse from thirst and disuse. "It's not far. We have to walk." We left her silver sedan in the parking lot. I did not look back at the motel. We started walking, two shadows moving against the flow of commuter traffic, keeping to the gravel shoulder of the industrial road. The air smelled of diesel fumes and hot asphalt. Above us, the neon sign of the 24-hour gas station buzzed and flickered, the red light flashing on and off like a desperate Morse code, signaling a warning I could not read. Lena walked fast, clutching the thick manila envelope to her chest. She kept looking over her shoulder, flinching at the sound of approaching headlights. As we passed under a flickering streetlight, she spoke again, breathless and strained. "If you get me there," she said, "if you get me to the gate, I'll reward you. I promise." I just nodded. I was not thinking about a reward. I was thinking about getting off this exposed road, away from the eyes of strangers. It took us maybe 15 minutes. The service road ended abruptly at a massive wall, at least 12 feet high, built from dark, imposing stone and topped with a severe line of wrought iron spikes. This was the South Gate. It was designed to keep the world out, or perhaps to keep something in. A small, dark infrared camera, mounted high above us, swiveled silently in its housing, tracking our approach. Lena hurried to a steel intercom box set directly into the stone. She pressed the button. A burst of static crackled, loud in the sudden quiet. It was followed by a man's voice, amplified and metallic, completely devoid of emotion. "Password." Lena's hand was shaking so badly she dropped the envelope. She snatched it up, smearing it with gravel. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and spoke clearly toward the box. "Black hawthorn." There was a heavy electronic thud, a sound of immense weight shifting, and the massive iron gates began to swing inward without a sound. Bright light spilled out from the manicured driveway beyond. An elderly man in a stark black suit was running or moving as fast as his aged dignity would allow down the gravel path. "Miss Vale," he called out, his voice tight with alarm. "We've been trying to reach you. The council." He stopped dead when he saw me. He was standing just behind her, illuminated in the floodlight from the drive, clutching my empty canvas bag. He looked at my worn cardigan, my dusty shoes, and his face, which had been merely alarmed, closed completely. Lena ignored him. She turned to me, her eyes suddenly clear and sharp. She grabbed my shoulders and pulled me into a fierce, trembling hug that smelled faintly of expensive perfume and fear. "You saved me," she whispered into my hair. "I keep my promises." She pulled back, and before I could react, before I could even process what was happening, she took the large, nickel-plated set of keys from her own hand. She pressed them firmly into mine. The metal was heavy and cool against my skin. "Take them," she whispered, but it was loud enough for the butler, Mr. Dorian, to hear. "Renfield needs a keeper worthier than they are." Mr. Dorian's face went white. He looked as if he might be physically sick. "Miss Vale, this is highly irregular. You must come inside, both of you. Now." He shot me a look of deep, profound suspicion, but his orders, it seemed, were clear. He ushered us past the gate, which swung shut behind us with that same heavy, final thud. I stepped inside and forgot how to breathe. The motel, the highway, the smell of diesel, it all evaporated. We were standing in a grand foyer. A massive crystal chandelier hung 2 stories above us, casting fractured rainbows on the polished marble floor. A double staircase swept upward on either side, the banisters gleaming. The air did not smell of bleach and stale smoke. It smelled of old money, of lemon oil and polished oak. This was another world, and I, Evelyn Hart, was holding the keys. Mr. Dorian led us into a vast drawing room. He disappeared and returned moments later with a silver tray. On it was a porcelain teapot, steaming, and 2 thick, warm towels. I wrapped one around my hands, which were shaking so badly I could barely hold the cup. The heat soaked into my skin. A shocking, profound comfort that almost brought me to tears. The sudden warmth made me remember the cold. It made me remember my youth. I remembered the smell of industrial dish soap from the restaurant kitchens where I washed dishes until my fingers were raw. I remembered the hum of my sewing machine late at night, taking in alteration work to save a few extra dollars. I remembered hunching over ledgers, calculating every penny, denying myself every small comfort, all for one goal. My apartment, Birch 3B. It was not grand, just 2 rooms and a small kitchen in Maple Bend. But it was mine. I owned it outright. It was the physical proof of 25 years of labor. It was my safety, my anchor, the one thing I had built for myself after my husband passed. Then Thomas met Sloane. The Pierces were old money, the kind that owned logistics companies and entire city blocks. Suddenly, my son, who had never balanced a checkbook, was an investment expert. "Mum, let me help you grow that nest egg," he'd said, his voice slick with new confidence. "I can make your money work for you." He started investing on my behalf. He had me sign what he called a temporary authorization, just to move funds around more easily. I signed it. He was my son. The erosion was gradual, insidious. First, my primary bank account was retitled as a joint account for estate planning purposes. Sloane had explained with a polite smile. Then my ATM card expired, and the replacement never arrived. Thomas handled my allowance, giving me cash for groceries. Always a little less than I needed. Sloane began setting my schedule, telling me when it was convenient for me to use the laundry, when to be home so I would not interrupt their dinners. Eventually, they sold Birch 3B. The market is perfect. "Mum," Thomas said, "we'll put the profit into a much better fund." They moved me into their sprawling, minimalist house. My room was a utility suite in the basement, next to the water heater. It was windowless, but Sloane had assured me it was very quiet. The rules were unspoken, but rigid. I was to remain in my room when they had guests. I was to eat after they had finished. I was to be grateful. I forced myself to be small, to be silent, not to be a bother. I told myself this was just a new phase of life. I endured it all, until the reconciliation trip to Ridgeway Springs, until the Juniper Motel. That was not an aberration. It was the final signature on a document I had been signing for years. They were in the library. Lena's voice cut through the memory. I looked up, blinking. I was still in the grand room at Renfield, the hot tea in my hand. "My entire family," Lena continued, pacing in front of a cold, massive fireplace, arguing over who had the right to control the estate, who had the right to control me. She had fled a formal family dinner, a party, she called it, with bitter irony. She had run out, grabbed her keys, smashed her phone so they could not track her, and just driven. "Mr. Dorian cleared his throat, his posture rigid with anxiety. "The Renfield Trust Council was present this morning. Miss Vale? They were insistent. No one anticipated you would simply leave the grounds. They wanted to have me declared unstable," Lena said, stopping her pacing. She turned and looked directly at me, her gaze intense, searching. The manufactured terror from the parking lot was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating intelligence. They were all in that room, looking at me, but seeing only a complication or a paycheck. "You," she said, nodding toward me. "You were the only person tonight who looked at me like I was a human being." I met her gaze. I thought of Thomas, of Sloane, of the police officer, of the motel clerk, of all the people who had looked through me. I gave a single, slow nod. The nickel-plated keys were still in my lap, impossibly heavy. They felt less like a gift and more like a weapon. Inside me, beneath the shame and the cold, the anger I had felt on the curb flickered again. This time, it was joined by something new, something I had not dared to feel in years. It was a terrifying, electric spark of opportunity. "We should move to the study," Mr. Dorian said. His voice, which had been anxious, was now low and conspiratorial. He led us out of the grand drawing room, down a hall panelled in dark, almost black, mahogany. The study was smaller, lined floor to ceiling with books that smelled of leather and old paper. He closed the heavy doors, and the silence of the house became absolute. "Mrs. Hart," he began, standing rigidly by a massive, carved desk. "To understand what Miss Vale has done, you must understand Renfield. This is not merely a house. It is a family trust. For the last 50 years, it has been exclusively managed by the law firm of Kepler and Finch LLP. Lena, who had been staring into the empty fireplace, gave a short, bitter laugh. "Managed," she said. "That's a gentle word for it." "Miss Vale," Dorian continued, his face impassive, is the sole designated beneficiary following the passing of her aunt. However, the Trust Council, which is comprised of the senior partners at Kepler and Finch, is currently moving to have her stabilized. That is the term they used in their brief this morning. They're trying to have me declared incompetent, Lena stated flatly. They think I am unstable. They want control. And they know I won't give it to them. Dorian nodded grimly. He walked to a section of the bookshelf and pressed a concealed latch. A portion of the wall swung inward, revealing a small, climate-controlled archive room. He returned with a thick, leather-bound volume and a slender file. "This is a copy of the will," he said, placing the volume on the desk. "But this," he said, tapping the file, "is the pertinent document, an addendum, handwritten by Miss Vale's aunt, filed with a separate notary." He opened it. The handwriting was elegant, forceful. It was a short paragraph, but one sentence stood out, heavily underlined. "Should my wishes ever be contested by those I have retained, the keys to this house shall pass to whomever exhibits true faith at the necessary moment, and they shall hold stewardship." "The keys," I repeated, looking at the heavy metal in my hand. "It is not just a poetic turn of phrase," Dorian said, his voice urgent. "It is a hidden legal clause. The keys are a physical trigger. The moment the beneficiary, Miss Vale, places them in the hand of a chosen protector, it activates a temporary right of guardianship. It allows her to appoint a gatekeeper." "A gatekeeper?" I asked. "A legal proxy," Lena said, stepping forward. "A position that legally invalidates the council's authority over me and the estate. For 30 days. It freezes them out completely. I want you to be the gatekeeper. Evelyn." The room tilted. I looked down at my worn cardigan, the grime from the curb still on my hands. "Miss Vale, I appreciate what you are trying to do, but I am the definition of unstable. I am 63 years old. I am homeless. I have no identification, no phone, no money. My son stole everything. I am legally invisible. I cannot fight a law firm." "That," Lena said, her voice sharp, "is exactly why you can. They are expecting a fight from someone who has something to lose. They will never see you coming." "Mr." Dorian was looking at me. His head tilted. The suspicion he had shown me at the gate was gone, replaced by a sudden, intense calculation. "Your name," he said slowly. "You said it was Evelyn Hart." I nodded. "From Maple Bend, Ohio." "Yes," I whispered, a cold dread rising. How could he know that I thought the name was familiar? He walked past me, toward a large, black, old-fashioned safe, half hidden by a tapestry. He spun the combination dial with practiced, clicking sounds. The heavy steel door hissed open. He reached into the dark interior and retrieved a single, thin file folder, yellowed at the edges. "This is the estate's contingency file," he said. "The late Mrs. Renfield was meticulous about redundant records." He opened the folder and laid it on the desk. I was looking at myself. It was a photocopy of a 30-year-old Ohio driver's license. The face was younger, strained, but recognizable. Beneath it was a copy of my Social Security card and a W-4 form. "You worked here," Dorian stated. The memory, buried under decades of raising Thomas, rushed back. It was a temporary job. I had just lost my husband. I needed the money. For 3 months. I had been on the supplemental cleaning staff for a private service that Renfield used for its spring cleaning. I had polished the silver. I had scrubbed the marble floors in the foyer. The estate, Dorian said, paid you 30 years ago. Evelyn Hart was on the payroll, and according to this file, we have notarized copies of your birth certificate and your social security card. They are sufficient to temporarily verify your identity for legal purposes. It was a perfect, impossible circle. I had been invisible on the curb, but here, in the one place I had ever been a servant, I was known. A sharp, digital ringing cut through the air. A dedicated phone line on the desk, one I had not noticed, was flashing. Dorian answered it. He listened, his face turning pale. He held the receiver out to Lena. "It is Mr. Kepler," he whispered. "He knows you left the grounds. He is furious. He says if you attempt any erratic delegation of authority, he will sue you and whomever you involve." Lena looked at the phone, then at me. I heard the threat. Kepler, Sloane, Thomas. They were all the same. Men in suits who used the rules to erase, to leave people on the curb. I clenched my fist around the heavy nickel keys. The cold metal bit into my palm. "Mr. Dorian," I said, my voice clear and hard. "Get the paperwork. I will sign it." The gatekeeper's memorandum was signed with a steady hand. The moment the ink dried, the air in the study changed. This was no longer a rescue. It was an alliance. Lena did not put me in a utility room. She led me up the grand, sweeping staircase, down a hall carpeted in wool so thick my feet sank into it, and opened the door to a guest suite in the west wing. The room was larger than my entire apartment at Birch 3B. In the centre sat a high, massive bed with a thick mattress, crisp, heavy cotton sheets, and a down comforter. It was the first time in over a year I would not be sleeping on a thin cot next to a loud water heater. I stood in the centre of the room, breathing in the scent of lemon polish and old, good wood. "Rest, Evelyn," Lena said from the doorway. "Dorian is arranging dinner." I hadn't realized I was starving until Mr. Dorian brought the tray himself. It wasn't a feast, but it was everything. A deep, heavy bowl of hot chicken soup, filled with thick noodles and vegetables. A slice of fresh, crusty bread, with a small pot of real butter. He had also brought a tall glass of ice water. I ate sitting on the edge of the magnificent bed, slowly, deliberately. Each spoonful was a restoration. It was the taste of being treated with decency, and it was so unfamiliar it almost made me ache. That night, I slept for 9 straight hours, a deep, dreamless sleep, unafraid of being a bother. I woke to bright sunlight. It was nearly 10 a.m. Mr. Dorian knocked lightly. "Mrs. Hart. I have arranged a video conference for 10:30, if you feel prepared." I pulled on a thick silk robe that had been left for me. "A conference with who?" "The Northbridge County Department of Social Services," he replied, his face impassive. "It appears the police officer you spoke to at the gas station filed a vulnerable adult welfare report after all. They need to formally verify the incident." He had a laptop waiting in the study. A woman with a kind, tired face appeared on the screen. She asked me to state my name. "Mr. Dorian held up my 30-year-old employment file to the camera to verify my identity. She asked me what happened at the Juniper Motel. I told her the truth. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply stated the facts. The reconciliation trip. The pretense of confirming tickets to steal my phone, the missing wallet, the room paid only until 11 a.m., the fact that Thomas and Sloane had checked out at 5 in the morning, leaving me with no money, no identification, and no way to contact anyone. I did not speak of my son's cruelty. I spoke of the actions. It was a cold, clear, factual case of elder abandonment and financial abuse. Mrs. Hart, the woman said, her kind face now rigid. We will be opening an immediate investigation into the actions of Thomas Hart and Sloane Pierce. When the call ended, I felt the first true easing of pressure in my chest in years. Dorian was already at the desk. The first step is insulation, he said, as if he were a general planning a campaign. They controlled you by controlling your access. We will fix that. He spent the next hour teaching me. He did not patronize me. He was clear and precise. He helped me create a new, temporary email address, secured with a password only I knew. Using that email, my verified identity from the estate files, and the Renfield address, he helped me open a new online-only bank account. Miss Vale has authorized a stipend for your services as gatekeeper, he said. The funds are being transferred. This account is in your name, and your name alone. I looked at the screen. A starting balance of $5,000. It was more liquid cash than I had been allowed to access in 2 years. The feeling of security lasted until precisely 4 p.m. Dorian was summoned to the south gate by a groundskeeper. He returned a few minutes later, holding a single, plain white envelope. It was left on the intercom box, he said. No postage, no name. He slit it open with a heavy silver letter opener. Inside was not a letter. It was a single, grainy, black and white photograph. I was looking at myself. It was me, sitting on the concrete curb at the Juniper Motel, my head in my hands, the empty canvas bag at my feet. The shot was taken from a distance, probably from a car parked across the street. They're watching us, Lena said. She had entered the room, her voice tight with alarm. Pull the security logs for the south gate, Dorian commanded into the house intercom. The last hour. The large monitor on the wall, disguised as a painting, flickered to life. We watched the footage. The timestamp read 2:13 p.m. A large, black, expensive-looking SUV idled at the edge of the road, just outside the gate, for almost 3 minutes. The window was tinted. The driver was invisible, but the camera automatically zoomed and captured the license plate. Dorian paused the frame. He typed the plate number into a search field on his computer. The result flashed on the screen: Registered Pierce Logistics, Corporate Fleet. My blood turned to ice. Sloane. It was Sloane's company. They knew I wasn't gone. They knew I wasn't lost on the highway. They had found me. The photograph wasn't a warning. It was a threat. We see you. We erased you once. We can do it again. They know you're here, Lena said, her voice a low whisper. Now they, and the council, are on the same side. They all want you gone. She turned to Dorian. Hire Ironbrook Protective. I want a full-time, nightly patrol, starting tonight. She looked at me, her eyes asking if I was going to collapse. The fear was real, a cold knot in my stomach. I remembered the powerlessness of the utility room, the humiliation of the curb. I could leave. I could take the $5,000 and vanish. But they would find me, and I would be alone. I looked at the photograph of the broken woman on the curb. That was not me. Not anymore. Yes, I said, my voice steady and clear. Hire them. This time. I am not running. My 30-day tenure as gatekeeper began not with a celebration, but with a declaration of war. Lena, using the estate's discretionary funds, hired an independent lawyer named Marla Keene. Marla was not a society lawyer. She was a former state prosecutor who specialized in financial fraud. She drove a sensible sedan, wore practical suits, and had the sharp, impatient eyes of someone who hated wasting time. We met in the Renfield study, the same room where I had signed the memorandum. Okay, Evelyn, she said, opening her laptop. Lena and Dorian have handled the estate side. Let's talk about your side, your son, your apartment, Birch 3B. Using the estate's resources, she had pulled every public filing connected to my name from the last 5 years. The sale of my apartment, the transfer of funds, and finally, the document that made it all possible. This is the power of attorney, she said, sliding a paper across the desk. Document 417B. It gave Thomas full authority over your assets. I stared at the signature line. Evelyn Hart. It was a good attempt. The loop of the E was correct, the sharp angle of the H, but the pressure was wrong. The T was crossed with a slight upward tilt, a habit Thomas had, not me. I always crossed my T straight across. That is not my signature, I said. The words came out cold and heavy. Marla Keene smiled, a thin, satisfied expression. I didn't think so. I had a forensic analyst look at the digital file this morning. It's a forgery. A very confident one, but a forgery nonetheless. She was already typing. I'm filing an emergency injunction with the Bank of North Shore. We're petitioning to freeze every known asset belonging to Thomas Hart and Sloane Pierce, citing criminal fraud. While Marla worked the phones, Dorian approached me. He was holding a small, leather-bound book, its pages brittle and brown. I thought this might clarify things. Mrs. Hart. It was the late aunt's personal diary. He had marked a page. Her familiar, forceful script read, Kepler thinks I am a fool. They do not understand. Wealth is a burden. It must be tested. My final test will be one of simple kindness. Whoever, in a moment of true crisis, helps the vulnerable without condition, that person is to be trusted. Miss Vale read this after her aunt passed. Dorian explained quietly. She was waiting for a sign, and then she found you, a woman abandoned, who still chose to help a stranger. You were the answer to the test. The weight of it settled on me. I wasn't just a random proxy. I was the fulfillment of a dead woman's wish. The battle for Renfield, however, was moving faster. An anonymous email arrived in the temporary account Dorian had set up for me. It was forwarded from a low-level employee at Kepler and Finch. The email chain was short and sickening. The Trust Council was in secret negotiations to sell the entire Renfield estate to a private equity firm, Rowan Harbour Capital. They were trying to close the deal before my 30-day gatekeeper status expired. They're selling it out from under Lena, I said to Marla. Then we stop them, she replied, not looking up. The next day, I put on a simple black dress from the late aunt's wardrobe. I took an estate car to the Harland Hotel for a 10 a.m. meeting I had arranged under a false pretense. I found the partners from Rowan Harbour Capital in the lobby, looking impatient. Gentlemen, I said, approaching their table. My name is Evelyn Hart. I am the current, legally appointed gatekeeper of the Renfield estate. I believe you are in negotiations with Kepler and Finch. Their faces went stiff. "That's a confidential matter," one said. "What is not confidential?" I said, my voice calm and low, "is that the estate is currently in legal dispute. The beneficiary, Miss Vale, has activated a clause that temporarily invalidates the counsel you are negotiating with. Any purchase you make right now is not a purchase. It is an entry ticket into a very long, very public, and very expensive lawsuit." I placed Marla's card on the table and walked away. The fallout was immediate. Marla received a call an hour later from a furious Mr. Kepler. Rowan Harbour had indefinitely frozen all negotiations, pending legal clarity. The council was trapped. Then came the personal attacks. A voice message appeared on the new, secure phone Dorian had given me. It was Thomas. His voice was thick with a false, whining sorrow. Mum, it's me. I don't know what happened. Sloane said you were taken care of. We need to talk. Please. I can explain everything." I saved the recording. I labeled it evidence. I did not reply. An hour later, a formal email from Sloane's personal attorney arrived in Marla's inbox. It was a cease and desist letter, threatening to file for a psychiatric evaluation and a lawsuit based on my clear mental instability and history of erratic behavior. The classic, dirty move. They were trying to build the same case against me that the council was trying to build against Lena. That night, the real panic set in. At 2:15 a.m., the silent alarm system for the east perimeter lit up the security office. The Ironbrook protective guards were there in seconds. They found a man, dressed in black, halfway over the east wall. The intruder dropped, rolling, and fled into the darkness of the adjoining woods. But he left something behind, snagged on the iron spikes. The guard brought it to the study. It was a single, black tactical glove, and clipped to the wrist, gleaming under the desk lamp, was an electronic key fob. I recognized the logo instantly. It was the stylized P of Pierce Logistics. Marla Keene did not sleep. By 5 a.m., she had filed an emergency motion. The court granted it by 9, a temporary restraining order, citing the forged signature, the harassment from Sloane's lawyer, the intimidating voicemail from Thomas, and the physical trespass by an agent of Pierce Logistics. Thomas Hart and Sloane Pierce were legally forbidden from coming within 500 feet of me, or of Renfield Estate. The injunctions and restraining orders were not the end. They were the signal for the public battle to begin. Kepler and Finch, unable to move legally, turned to the press. It started as whispers on local community forums, then escalated to veiled articles in the Ridgeway Springs Gazette. The narrative was simple and ugly, the cunning grifter. Elderly woman manipulates troubled heiress. Stranger seizes Renfield Estate. They painted me as a predator, a homeless opportunist who had sunk her claws into a vulnerable young woman. The Trust Council, the articles suggested, was merely trying to protect Lena from her own poor judgment and her new, dangerous puppet master. The town, which had previously ignored me on the curb, was now fascinated by my supposed villainy. People slowed down as they drove past the Renfield gates, hoping to catch a glimpse of the old woman who stole the mansion. Lena, however, was done being protected. She arranged an interview with Ren 88, the local community radio station. She went on air, her voice clear and steady. She did not talk about me. She talked about her life. She spoke of the isolation, of being treated like a difficult piece of property. of the council members who called her unstable in meetings she was not invited to. She told them how they had tried to force her to sign away her own rights in her own home, and how, in a moment of desperation, she had fled. "I ran," she told the host, "and the only person who treated me with basic human kindness was a woman sitting on a motel curb, a woman who had nothing." It was a powerful counter-narrative. I knew I had to speak, but I would only do it once. Marla arranged a single, sit-down interview with a respected reporter from the Northbridge regional paper. I did not speak of Thomas's cruelty or Sloane's malice. I did not mention the forged signature or the Pierce Logistics key fob. I kept the focus tight, narrow, and unassailable. I spoke about the dignity of the elderly. I spoke about what it feels like to be deemed invisible. I told the story of the Juniper Motel, of the phone being taken, of the 11 a.m. checkout, of being left on a curb with no identification and no money. I did not need to call them names. The facts were an indictment, all on their own. The effect was electric. The story was no longer about a mansion. It was about a mother. The public narrative inverted overnight. The comments sections changed from suspicion to outrage. A local activist group started a hashtag that began trending in the small-town way, gatekeeper not thief. Kepler and Finch, seeing the tide turn, panicked. Their lawyers sent Marla a final, furious letter, threatening every kind of legal action, from defamation to conspiracy. It was a bluff, and Marla called it. She responded not with a letter, but with a formal legal memorandum, attaching a copy of the hidden addendum from the will, the one granting me gatekeeper status. She cited the exact, obscure trust law that made it ironclad. It was a legal broadside, and it sent them reeling. As the council's public position crumbled, their internal one fractured. A new, anonymous email appeared in my inbox. It was from a former associate at Kepler and Finch. "They are acting in bad faith," the message read. "They have been since the beginning." Attached was a document. It was the firm's internal timeline. It proved they had deliberately stalled the execution of the aunt's will, delaying key filings to create a window of opportunity, all in an attempt to get the Rowan Harbour capital sale approved before Lena could formally take control. They were not protecting the estate, they were liquidating it for a fee. The last piece of the puzzle came from our own defences. Ironbrook Protective, the security firm, delivered their nightly log. At 2:13 in the morning, the long-range thermal camera had captured a vehicle idling at the end of the access road, just outside the 500-foot restraining order line. The zoom lens was powerful. It captured the driver, sitting alone in the dark, bathed in the green glow of his phone screen. It was Thomas. "We have it all," Marla said, her voice grimly satisfied. She compiled everything: the forged power of attorney, the bank records, the threatening voicemail from Thomas, the threatening letter from Sloane's lawyer, the Pierce Logistics key fob, the anonymous ex-employee's timeline, and the thermal image of Thomas violating the spirit, if not the precise letter, of the restraining order. She electronically filed the entire package with the Northbridge Circuit Court. The court's response was faster than any of us anticipated. The presiding judge, an honourable woman known for her impatience with legal games, saw the pattern. She did not wait for a standard hearing date. She issued an immediate summons for an emergency hearing in 72 hours. "They will come prepared to fight about the will," Dorian advised me that evening, his face drawn with worry. "You must have a definitive surprise, Mrs. Hart." Something they cannot anticipate. I smiled. A small, thin expression. The anger that had been simmering since the motel curb was now cold, sharp, and patient. "Oh, I have one," I said. Later that night, Lena came to my room. She did not speak. She simply handed me a second set of keys. They were older than the main set, made of brass and iron. On the single, small key that hung from the ring, a word was etched into the metal vault A. That night, the house was silent. The Ironbrook guards were patrolling the perimeter, invisible in the darkness. Just before midnight, Lena, Dorian, and I descended to the sub-basement. The air grew cold and smelled of damp stone and ozone. Dorian stopped before a seamless part of the wall, pressing his palm to a concealed scanner. The panel slid open, revealing a circular steel door, like that of a bank vault. "Vault A," Dorian said, his voice hushed. "The original archive." He used one of the heavy brass keys from the ring Lena had given me. There was a loud, satisfying thud as the mechanical tumblers turned. He then entered a long code into an electronic keypad, which beeped softly in the quiet. The heavy door hissed open on pneumatic hinges. The room inside was not large, but it was packed with history. Metal shelves held rows of grey, archival document boxes and racks of microfilm. This was the heart of Renfield. The late Mrs. Renfield did not trust Kepler and Finch, Dorian said, moving with purpose to a specific shelf. She kept her own originals. The copy of the will I showed you in the study was just that. A copy. "This," he said, pulling down a heavy, sealed box, "is the original." He laid it on a steel table. Inside, beneath layers of archival tissue, was the real will, and attached to it, the original handwritten addendum. It was identical to the copy, with one crucial difference. The notary stamp in the corner was not from a local bank. It was from an independent, out-of-state registrar, dated just one day before her death. Kepler and Finch had never seen this version. Lena read the clause, her breath catching. "It's different." I read it over her shoulder. The copy had granted the gatekeeper temporary stewardship. The original was a bomb. It stated, "Should the Trust Council act in a manner contrary to the financial and familial interests of the estate, the appointed gatekeeper shall have the sole and binding authority to designate a replacement management structure." "She gave you the power to fire them all," Lena whispered, staring at me. Dorian was already pulling another box. "There is more." He produced a single, yellowed voucher. It was a payroll certificate. "Evelyn Hart, supplemental domestic staff, $32.50. It was my pay stub from 30 years ago. "It establishes a proven, documented, historical link," Dorian said. "She knew you. She remembered." Beneath that was a thick, cream-coloured envelope, sealed with dark purple wax. It was addressed simply to Lena. Lena broke the seal, her hands shaking. She read the letter aloud, her voice trembling. "My dearest Lena, if you are reading this, the men I trusted have failed you. You will be cornered. When that happens, do not choose a fighter. Choose someone who has been invisible. Choose someone who has been dismissed. They are the only ones who truly understand the value of a home." A final item sat on the bottom shelf. Seemingly out of place, a modern, external hard drive. Dorian plugged it into a dedicated, air-gapped laptop on the table. The drive was full of emails, secretly copied by the late aunt's private secretary. It was the complete, uncensored correspondence of the Trust Council. We watched as they discussed the Rowan Harbour capital sale, laughing about undervaluing the land for a quick commission and a substantial kickback to an offshore account. We had it. The original will, the proof of my past connection, the aunt's explicit intent, the hard evidence of their conspiracy. As we prepared to leave the vault, a piercing, digital alarm shattered the silence. It was not a fire alarm. It was a perimeter breach. A red light flashed on a security panel by the door. "The East Garden," Dorian said, his voice sharp. "Someone triggered the motion sensor by the rose bushes." We sealed the vault and ran upstairs. In the main security office, the Ironbrook guards were already coordinating. "We have eyes on one individual, fleeing south." A voice crackled over the radio. "They're fast." We watched the monitor. A guard was sprinting across the lawn, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. He stopped near the wall, by the rose bushes, and bent down. "Subject is over the wall. They dropped something." A moment later, the guard came to the study, holding a small, black object in his gloved hand. It was a USB audio recorder. "She must have been trying to plant it," Lena said, "or retrieve it." I asked. "I saw her," the guard said, catching his breath. "Just a shadow. But I saw her go over the wall. The profile. It was a woman. Sloane Pierce." Dorian took the recorder and plugged it into the laptop. There was only one file on it. It was a conversation, recorded in a quiet room, perhaps a car. The audio was crystal clear. Sloane's voice was low, cutting, impatient. "It's a loose end, Thomas. You can't just leave her in a motel. She's not stupid. She'll find a way to a shelter." Then, Thomas's voice, weaker, whining. "What do you want me to do? Sloane, it's done. She has nothing." "Nothing is not enough," Sloane snapped. "We need this sale to go through. We need your assets clear. I need you to understand. We have to make your mother disappear permanently from our financial map. Are you capable of understanding that? Or not?" The audio file ended. The room was deathly quiet. I looked at the collection on the desk, the forged power of attorney that stole my apartment, the original, notarized will that gave me the power to fire the council. And now, a recording of my son and his partner conspiring to erase me. The 3-day wait for the hearing was no longer a period of suspense. It was a countdown to an execution. I knew exactly what I had to do. The Northbridge Circuit Court was beige, functional, and cold. The air, heavy with the smell of cheap floor wax, was thick with tension. Lena and I, as plaintiffs, sat at one table with Marla Keene. Across the aisle sat the defendants, the senior partners of Kepler and Finch, their faces polished masks of indignation. 2 rows back, summoned as related parties, sat Thomas and Sloane. Thomas looked like he had been awake for days, his face pale and slick with sweat. Sloane sat bolt upright, staring at the judge, projecting an aura of absolute bored immunity. Marla Keene stood. She did not open with rhetoric. She began with evidence. "Your Honor, we begin with the foundational document, not the copy probated by Kepler and Finch, but the original, executed will of the late Mrs. Renfield, secured from her private archive, Vault A. Mr. Kepler, the senior partner, was on his feet immediately. "Objection. The probated will is the legal document of record. This is a procedural tactic." "A tactic, Your Honor," Marla countered smoothly. "That centers on this. She used a pointer on the projected document. An independent, out-of-state notary stamp, dated 24 hours before the testator's death. A stamp the council was unaware of, because they were not present. The judge peered at the screen over her glasses. The notary appears valid. Ms. Keene. The court accepts the document. Proceed. The partners at the defense table began whispering furiously. Second, Marla continued, we present evidence of gross financial misconduct, a hard drive and microfilm, also from Vault A. The monitors flashed to life. Emails, spreadsheets, the secret negotiations with Rowan Harbour Capital, the casual discussion of undervaluing the land, the memos detailing the plan to manage Lena. This is privileged communication, Kepler roared, standing again. It is a conspiracy to defraud the beneficiary. Your Honour? Marla replied, her voice lethally calm. Which brings us to our third item, an audio recorder, recovered from the Renfield grounds during an attempted trespass. Objection, Kepler yelled. Chain of custody relevance. This is inadmissible. The chain of custody is impeccable, Marla said. The Ironbrook guard who recovered it is present to testify, and its relevance. She paused, letting the silence hang. Will be immediately clear. The trespasser was identified as Sloane Pierce, who is present in this courtroom. The judge's eyes, sharp and intelligent, moved from Marla to Sloane. Sloane did not flinch. Overruled, the judge said. Play the audio. The sharp, cold sound of Sloane's voice filled the room. We have to make your mother disappear permanently from our financial map. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating. Every eye in the room was on Thomas, who had gone from pale to grey. He seemed to shrink, physically collapsing in on himself under the weight of his own betrayal. Before Kepler could find his voice, Marla pivoted. Your Honour, this conspiracy to financially disappear my client is not theoretical. It began years ago. She projected the next image, the power of attorney, document 417B. She presented the forensic analysis of the forgery. This document, Marla said, was used to fraudulently sell my client's home, Birch 3B, and seize her assets. We are petitioning for an immediate emergency freeze on all accounts and properties held by Thomas Hart and Sloane Pierce. Thomas, finally breaking, lurched to his feet. Your Honour, please, this is a misunderstanding. I love my mother. If I could just talk to her, I could explain. The judge's gavel struck the wood with a sound like a gunshot. Sit down, Mr. Hart, she commanded, her voice cutting through his whine. This court is not interested in your performative displays of maternal love. I am interested only in facts and legal interests, and the facts presented here are appalling. Thomas crumpled back into his seat. Marla called her final witness, Mr. Dorian. Dorian, in his immaculate black suit, testified in a low, clear voice. He stated that he had personally overheard the Trust Council in the library discussing the expediency of a quick liquidation of Renfield, while the late Mrs. Renfield was still alive, dying in her room upstairs. This was the final blow. The council's lawyers sat stunned, their defense shattered. The judge turned to Lena. Miss Vale, in light of this testimony, what is your request? Lena stood, her voice not trembling, but ringing with authority. Your Honour, exercising the rights granted by the original addendum of my aunt's will, I, through my legally appointed gatekeeper, Evelyn Hart, am formally requesting the immediate removal of the current Trust Council. I hereby designate Evelyn Hart as temporary manager of the Renfield Trust. The judge looked at the stack of evidence, then at the partners from Kepler and Finch, then at me. This court finds overwhelming evidence of bad faith, self-dealing, and potential criminal conspiracy by the council. The judge declared, "The authority of Kepler and Finch over the Renfield Trust is hereby suspended, effective immediately, for a period of 90 days. She looked at her calendar. A final ruling on the dissolution of the council and the appointment of a new manager will be delivered at the conclusion of that period. The war was won. The execution was set for the final hearing. The night before the final hearing, a motion sensor at the south gate was triggered. It was not an intruder, just a single, pathetic figure. Thomas. He was standing just outside the gate, in the beam of the security light, weeping. He called my name, his voice breaking. I answered over the intercom, my voice as cold and clear as the steel gate between us. "Mom, please." He sobbed. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. Sloane. She made me. Please. Mom, don't do this. I'm your son." I looked at the grainy image of his face on the monitor. "Regret is not a bargaining chip, Thomas," I said. And I cut the connection. I did not watch him walk away. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. The air was electric. There was a new face at the prosecutor's table, a representative from the Northbridge County District Attorney's Office. "Your Honor," he announced, "in light of the evidence of financial fraud and criminal elder abuse presented in the emergency hearing, our office has opened a formal investigation. Kepler's lawyers, looking pale, tried to argue that the 90-day suspension was sufficient. They were wrong. Marla Keene stood for her final argument. Your Honor, the council's bad faith did not end when Mrs. Hart was appointed gatekeeper. They continued to act against the trust's interests, even while this court was deliberating. She produced her final, shocking piece of evidence. It was a draft sales contract for Renfield Estate, addressed to Rowan Harbour Capital. It was dated 2 days after the emergency hearing, and at the bottom was the electronic signature of Mr. Kepler himself. They were trying to sell the property while it was actively in dispute, Marla stated. The judge's face was granite. She did not hesitate. Her gavel came down, and her ruling was swift and total. The contract with Kepler and Finch is terminated, effective immediately, she declared. This court is referring its entire findings, including this attempt to subvert a court proceeding, to the District Attorney for Criminal Investigation. Mr. Kepler looked as though he had been struck. The judge turned to my personal case. Regarding Birch 3B, the power of attorney 417B is hereby ruled null and void, an instrument of fraud. This court orders Thomas Hart and Sloane Pierce to make full restitution for the value of the apartment, plus 8% interest, and punitive damages. A permanent restraining order is granted. Thomas Hart and Sloane Pierce are forbidden from contacting or approaching Evelyn Hart indefinitely. Finally, she addressed Renfield. Based on the original addendum, this court recognizes the authority of the gatekeeper. I hereby affirm the dissolution of the existing council. I appoint Evelyn Hart as property manager of the Renfield Trust for a term of 1 year, with full authority to audit its finances and restructure the council in the best interests of the beneficiary. Miss Vale, it was over. Dorian was immediately appointed operations supervisor. Lena, free from the council, became the key beneficiary, with me as her advisor. But the judge was not quite finished. She looked at the district attorney. Given the audio evidence and Mr. Hart's presence in this courtroom, before she could finish, 2 bailiffs moved. They walked directly to the back row. We heard Thomas let out a thin, high-pitched wail. No, please. One bailiff cuffed his hands behind his back. You are in violation of a temporary restraining order and are being detained on charges of financial fraud, the bailiff stated. The judge looked at Sloane. A separate indictment for conspiracy to commit fraud will be served on you, Ms. Pierce. Sloane stared ahead, her mask of immunity finally cracking into a rictus of pure, unadulterated hatred. We walked out of the courthouse into a blinding wall of camera flashes and shouting reporters. Lena held my arm. Dorian walked behind us, a shield. They shoved microphones in my face. Evelyn, what do you have to say to your son? How does it feel to own Renfield? I stopped. The crowd went silent. I looked directly into the nearest camera, and I said the only thing that mattered. Dignity is not a privilege, it is a birthright. We drove back to the estate. The reporters did not follow. I walked alone to the tall, wrought iron south gate, the one I had first approached as a destitute, invisible woman. I took the heavy, nickel-plated key from my pocket. I put it in the lock. I turned it. The gate swung open silently, revealing the long, sun-dappled gravel drive and the beautiful sprawling gardens beyond. It was my home. I stepped inside, and I did not look back. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I'd really love to connect with you all. So please drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from and share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, like this video, and give us your support by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more folks.